Hi, I'm Sean McVeigh. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the Sacrament of Marriage. One of the things I'd like to mention right off the bat here is that marriage is a covenant relationship. A covenant is far more than just a contract. It is a binding relationship unto death. Marriage is a sacrament. It is a vocation. It is a divine calling from God. It's not just some random default thing that people do. This is a divine calling from God above. And I'm going to be, pulling some quotes from the United States Catholic Catechism for Adults here. I have the original version. They actually have an updated version of this now, so I'm going to be pulling from this first edition here. The vocation of marriage is written in the very nature of man and woman as they come from the hand of the Creator. Marriage is not a purely human institution. That's actually from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The two are united in an unbreakable bond. Sacred Scripture begins with the creation and union of man and woman and ends with the wedding feast of the Lamb. So what we see here is the bookends of the Bible are deeply connected to marriage and the wedding feast. And this is God's design. This is God's plan. What God is showing us is that marriage is sacred to Him, and it should be sacred to us. Now, as I'm going to talk about later on in this presentation, we have some challenges in our current culture, challenges that try to pull away from this dignity and sanctity of this vocation and sacrament of matrimony. To help bring us back to that sacredness, we need to recognize that we are made in the image and likeness of God. And the permanent and exclusive fidelity of marriage illustrates the unending fidelity of God to His covenant with Israel and His will that Israel be faithful to Him alone. So marriage is a representation of the love of God on earth. God's love for us is faithful. And we're called to that same faithfulness in marriage, where our culture is a bit off track. I've heard it said like, if you're not happy, you should, get divorced and find a marriage or a relationship where you're going to be happy. And that's related to feeling good, but the love of the cross is not about feeling good. It's about laying down your life out of love for the other. And that's what marriage is supposed to be about. You enter into a covenant relationship and lay down your life for that person, and you are to be faithful to that person unto death do you part. That's part of the wedding vows you hear pronounced at a wedding. Like, I take this person as my bride, to have and to hold, for rich or for poor, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. That is the intention of God, and that is the direction the church leads us. But there are attempts by some in contemporary society to change the definition or understanding of what exactly constitutes marriage. Efforts to gain approval for and acceptance of same-sex unions as marriages are examples. While the church clearly teaches that discrimination against any group of people is wrong, efforts to make cohabitation, domestic partnerships, same-sex unions, and polygamous unions equal to marriage are misguided and also wrong. The church and her members need to continue to be a strong and clear voice in protecting and understanding of marriage, which is rooted in the natural law and revealed in God's law. So what does that mean for us? What the church is saying here is that the bond of marriage between a husband and a wife, a man and a woman, it mirrors the image of God and is life-giving. So there's a natural component. So if we take a man and a woman, for instance, they can naturally conceive and bring forth a child. That's part of God's plan. Two individuals in a homosexual relationship are not able to conceive naturally. There is no possibility of that happening by any natural means. It's because God did not intend for that type of relationship to be able to bring forth life. Now, we do not discriminate against these people. The church teaches us that in that quote I just shared with you. We're to love these people and encourage them to be holy. And for all people, we are called to live chastely. Now, if we're not married, that means we're called to live a life of celibacy. But even in marriage, it's not a free-for-all. And, we can't just have sex whenever we want. There is a discernment component there. You need to be able to bring life into the world. The church allows for the spacing of children for good reason. Let's say there's a serious medical issue that one of the spouses is facing and they want to try to get through that before having a child. Well, okay, but you're called to do it in an appropriate means, and the church gives us the format called natural family planning, which you basically are abstaining from sexual activity through the time periods of the month where the woman would be able to conceive. So there's a gift of self even in that. You're sacrificing, you're not just gratifying or pleasing yourself whenever you want, you're actually sacrificing out of love for the other. Like if my spouse is going through cancer treatment and I want to wait until they've made it through the cancer treatment before we try to conceive, or whatever the case is, that would be an example of a serious medical situation. Then I would be making also the gift of myself by restraining myself from engaging in those types of activities. So that's where natural family planning is different than artificial contraception, which we've talked about when we were talking about morality and different things like that in the RCIA process. But coming back to this topic, we're called to love people, all people, but it's not okay to try to make equal a homosexual relationship, try to make that equal to marriage, because that does not image the love of God the Father. So the love of the Trinity is mirrored in a life-giving family. So the Father pours out his love on the Son. The Son receives that love totally and returns that gift of love to the Father. And that love that goes between the Son and the Father is the Holy Spirit. And that is mirrored in the marriage relationship. The husband loves his wife completely. She receives that life completely, or that love completely, and returns that love in the form of life. So there's this life-giving cycle that mirrors the Trinity that is not possible in a homosexual type of relationship. So it does not mirror the love and flow of the Trinity, and therefore it is not equal to a sacramental marriage. And so the church says we need to safeguard that. Another thing that was mentioned there was cohabitation outside of marriage. So people are playing husband and wife, but not giving the commitment of husband and wife. And that is a degradation to the sanctity of that spousal relationship. So we're called to up the bar to a lifelong commitment if we want to live with somebody. And our culture has desensitized itself to that. But it's up to us to foster that in our own lives and in our families. And there may be people watching who are cohabitating, who are not married, and it's actually not helping their long-term relationship because they're putting the cart before the horse. And of course, you're going to hear every reason under the sun, like, well, we couldn't afford this, so we moved in together, and so there's an economic component there. But that does make it difficult to live out the marriage vocation in that relationship. But let's look at the natural law as it's related to this. So what is natural law? It is expressed in the way God made us. He made them male and female and told them to be fruitful and multiply. Therefore, procreation was a necessary component of the marriage union relationship that God created. In other words, being able to naturally have children is part of God's plan for marriage. you may have heard the argument, or somebody might bring it up, like, well, what about a man and a woman who get married and they're not able to conceive? Well, that does happen, and God has a plan, but the natural intention for their body organs are intended to be able to procreate. Whether or not a specific couple is able to conceive or not, that doesn't remove the natural plan. So God gave a male certain body parts and a female certain body parts that, when they're used together, have the ability to procreate. That shows God's intention for the relationship. And I do want to reemphasize that this is sacred to God. Marriage is sacred to God. Jesus' first miracle was at a wedding feast, and we see that in the Gospel of John, chapter 2. And as is recorded in Matthew's Gospel, it says, some Pharisees approached Jesus and tested him, saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause whatever?" He said in reply, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no human being tear apart.'" And St. Paul affirms this when he says a wife should not separate from her husband, and a husband should not divorce his wife. So the love of husband and wife reflects the love of God for us. By their marriage, the couple witnesses Christ's spousal love for the church. Jesus will always be faithful to his bride, the church. So think about this for a minute. When we say the church, what are we talking about? We're not talking about a building. We're talking about people. The community of people who have accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. This is the church. I'm part of the church. Everyone who's going through this process is doing it to become part of the church. And we are the spouse of Jesus. And as we heard already, God's intention for marriage is that it's not dissolvable. It's until death do us part. It's a permanent covenant relationship throughout one's life here on earth. And just as marriage is not intended to be broken, God's love for us is not going to be broken. God will not stop loving us. He will not divorce us. God will always be faithful to us. And then it might be a little harder for us to conceive and understand that in our mind because of the way marriage is treated in our current culture. But hopefully you get the picture here of what I'm talking about. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life is by its nature ordered toward the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. The covenant between baptized persons has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament. And as I've mentioned, marriage is a covenant, not a contract. It is a permanent union of persons capable of knowing and loving each other and God. The celebration of marriage is also a liturgical act. And the liturgy, if you'll recall from earlier in our process, in the RCIA process, the liturgy refers to the work of God with the work of the people. So it's the work of the people in union with the work of God. And what's the work of God? Salvation. So the celebration of marriage is also a liturgical act. It's the work of salvation appropriately held at a public liturgy at church. Catholics are urged to celebrate their marriage within the Eucharistic liturgy. And how would you not want that if you understand what the liturgy is? So in the liturgy at the Catholic Church, we are experiencing the presence of Jesus, the Lord, both in word and in sacrament. So when you're coming to get married before God, to have God the center of your marriage, wouldn't you want that to take place in the Eucharistic liturgy, where Jesus is the center of the liturgy, that we are receiving him in word and in sacrament. That's why the church strongly encourages us and urges us to make our marriage, or have our marriage take place in the liturgical life of the church, in the Mass. In the Latin Rite, the free consent of the couple is at the heart of the marriage celebration. And the spouses are the ministers of Christ's grace. They mutually confer the sacrament of matrimony upon each other. The priest or deacon is actually just a witness to the marriage on behalf of the church. I think that's an important thing to think about. That this sacrament is not instituted by the priest or the minister or the deacon. It's the couple. And sacraments are things, they are outward signs instituted by Jesus to give us grace. And that grace flows to us through the church. So why would we not want to get married in the church? We're living in a world right now that has made sport of marriage. And some people are getting married in all kinds of strange places or destination weddings because it's exciting. But commitment is not about excitement. It's about making a choice to give yourself to the other with Christ at the center of that. So marriage itself takes place through the public consent of the couple. The exchange of rings is a symbol of their publicly made consent. Marriage is ordered to the good of the couple as well as generating an education of children, as I mentioned. What God has joined together, let no human being separate. No one can dissolve a valid, sacramental, consummated marriage bond. Marriage requires fidelity and is indissoluble. Since it is God's intention that we remain together until death when we get married, we can expect challenges to come about to help us realize that we need to change certain behaviors about ourselves in order to become holy. So think about this in the context of the way our culture views marriage. And I've alluded to this already. So if those of you who are in marriage, arguments or challenges may come up, or discrepancies, issues, whatever, however you want to look at it, things will happen in life that will challenge the relationship. It's inevitable. How do we respond to that? Well, according to what the church teaches us, our first response is, well, I've committed myself to this until death. So how can I handle this situation to help us move forward? And through working through those situations in that way, the individuals grow in holiness. We live in a culture right now that often just wants to run away. I don't like this situation. I'm going to run away and look for something that makes me feel good again. But that's not what growth in holiness is about. Growth in holiness is about confronting those things that challenge us, work through it, remain faithful and dedicated and committed, and through that process, that's how we're purified and made holy in God's eyes. Marital intimacy and the good of the children require total fidelity to conjugal love. This flows from Christ's own fidelity to the church, which he loves so much that he died for her. Spouses lead each other toward holiness through the grace they receive in the sacrament of matrimony. Parents are the primary educators of the children in the Catholic faith, and the family forms what is called the domestic church. They are the church in the world, and they minister God's grace to each other and even to the world around them. Like, I teach my children the faith, and I have watched my little children evangelize the little children of the neighbors, telling them about Jesus, telling them about God, talking to them about the Catholic faith. I mean, my 6-year-old was once asking the neighbor about if their church was Catholic or not, and creating a Catholic conversation. And I was just like, wow, go for it, But that is us, my wife and I, passing on the faith to the children. The children just think, hey, it's normal to talk about the faith. And so when we're with other people, they just are normally talking to them about God and about faith and about Catholicism, because to them, this is our normal conversations. In a sense, our family, our domestic church, is evangelizing the world around us. And how exciting is that? And this is important because we live in a world where marriage and family life is under attack. We need to be educated on what proper marriage is and share that with others. Cultural changes in recent times have undermined God's will for marriage. The so-called sexual revolution, aided by artificial contraception, has made it more culturally acceptable for men and women to have sexual relations without having to marry each other. The availability of abortion also lowers the concern of unwanted pregnancy. And this relates to that whole commitment. Like, people engage in sexual activity for gratification purposes and don't have to worry about consequences. Well, consequences happen all the time, but they are reduced with all these things that are available, such as artificial contraception. But this degrades God's intention for the spousal marriage covenant relationship. As I already mentioned, the casual acceptance of unmarried cohabitation and the couples entering marriage without a permanent commitment contradicts the very nature of marriage. The political pressure of the legalization of same-sex unions is yet another step in the erosion of God's plan for marriage and the undermining of marriage in the natural moral order of creation. Now, as I've already mentioned, we're called to care about others, and especially in this case, people who have attractions to people of the same sex. While we're called to care about them, caring about somebody is not giving them whatever they want. Like, if we wake up in the morning and my kids just want to eat ice cream and junk food for breakfast, if I let them and they end up with a stomach ache, did I really help them? No, I allowed them to please their senses and hurt their body in doing so. When we think about the spiritual well-being of a person, if you want to please your senses with these attractions, well, that's your choice, but it's going to hurt you. It's going to make you spiritually sick, because God didn't make us to simply be sexually gratified. God made us to grow in holiness. And as I've already talked about, in a marriage relationship, that's a grinding process. There's going to be challenges. You're going to suffer. You're going to have to work out those challenges with your spouse. And part of the spousal intention is unification and procreation through the sexual act, which again is not possible in a homosexual relationship. So we love them, but in loving them, we encourage them to follow the path that is righteous, which doesn't involve sexual intimacy in that type of relationship. But I've never known anyone who's been totally satisfied with life because they've been able to have sex. It's a fleeting feeling. And if you base all of your focus on that, you live an unstable, unsatisfied life because you can't sustain that type of a feeling. It's not possible. It's not intended to be sustained. If you think about when God made us, and then the way He naturally made us was to indicate to us what is good. So when we eat, it tastes good. It's telling us, oh, this is good for me to do. But we now live in a disordered state due to original sin. Our members have been disordered, and now our passions incline us towards sin. So if I start eating and it tastes good and I keep eating and I keep indulging, I can fall into the sin of gluttony. And what's the long-term effect of that? You'll see me put on weight and my health will degrade and degrade. I'm killing myself. I'm slowly killing myself through sin. So you'll see that on the outward expression of what's happening spiritually inwardly. And the same can happen when we think about the appetite for sex. If someone keeps feeding into that, their soul is just dying. They will not find fulfillment and happiness in that path. So when we think of the couple with a same-sex attraction, we actually help them by encouraging them to live righteously and pursue God. And you're not going to find fulfillment in that relationship. It's not possible. If they choose to go try it anyway, they will reach a point in time where they realize, I'm not happy and fulfilled like I thought I would be, or like I wanted to be. And it's because of the way God made us. The only way we can be fulfilled is to live righteously the way God calls us to, and lay down our lives out of love. That is a total different thing than the gratification that we're talking about in these types of situations. In her teaching, the church gives us a picture of family life that begins with the total gift of love between the spouses, evidenced in their resolve to remain exclusively faithful unto death. Lust and domination, which stem from sin, can ruin a marriage. Sadly, some spouses fail to benefit from the Lord's help and from the many professional resources and support offered to them. It truly takes the effort of both individuals to have a successful relationship. If one person is not willing to put in the effort, it is difficult for the relationship to withstand the pressures and challenges of our world. I've personally known a number of friends that I grew up with who got married and ended up in divorce, and it was because the marriage was in not balanced. Like, one person in the marriage was doing everything he or she could to keep the marriage together, while the other person, it seemed like, wanted the marriage to fail. In a sense, they had already made their choice and were working toward the end result of that choice by not contributing to working for a successful relationship. And by successful, I mean a faithful relationship. So it really takes both parties to work at it and to want to work at it for it to really work out. That's why both sides make a commitment on their wedding day. And we have to pray that both uphold that commitment. However, when one or both do not stay faithful to that commitment and the relationship ends in divorce, we need to realize that the church supports divorced individuals. The church wants them to feel welcomed at our church. The church also calls them to frequent the sacraments, especially the Holy Eucharist, to strengthen them. So I've met and talked to people who've known individuals who've gone through a divorce and thought, oh, I'm not allowed to go to church anymore. That is totally wrong. The church wants you, the church calls you, especially to engage in the sacraments. And in order to receive the Eucharist, those who are already baptized and received their first communion, they need to go to confession to stay in a right relationship with God. So utilizing the sacrament of penance is also very important. If a person is in a situation where they divorced or their spouse divorced them and then they got remarried or they were pursuing a new relationship, that changes this dynamic a little bit. If someone divorces and remarries without a decree of nullity from the first marriage, that person is openly living in the sin of adultery with the second marriage. And the church cannot offer the sacrament of the Eucharist because that person would be living in mortal sin, a direct sin. So when you get married, it's until death. Now, even if you get a civil divorce, that doesn't mean you're free to remarry, because you are still committed to that in God's eyes until death. Now, there are situations where an annulment can be granted, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But I just want to finish what I'm saying here. Even somebody who is divorced, and even if they enter into an inappropriate relationship, the church still encourages those people to be actively involved in their parish and attend the Sunday Eucharist, even though they cannot receive Holy Communion. At the same time, they are encouraged to work toward getting themselves in a right relationship with God. So that kind of brings in that whole concept of an annulment and what that is. So let's just take a look at what do we mean by an annulment, what's taking place there. So a marriage of two baptized persons celebrated according to the norms of the church law is always presumed to be valid. When a marriage has broken down, this presumption remains in effect until the contrary is proven. That's why the person can't just remarry. When a church court, the tribunal, investigates and issues a declaration of nullity, it does not mean there was not a civil, sexual, or emotional marriage relationship, nor does it mean that the children of the union are illegitimate. The declaration means that no sacramental bond, or in the case of one party's being unbaptized, no natural bond, took place because at the time of the wedding, the standards for a valid sacramental marriage were not met. So let me just try to state this in layman's terms. When two people come and get married, and let's say they get a divorce. Now let's say this individual here wants to get married again. Well, the church has to look at this first marriage to see if it's even possible to get remarried. So they're looking if the components were present for a valid sacramental marriage to take place. If those components weren't there, the church can say, okay, you never entered into a sacramental union, which means you are still able to do so. That's what the annulment is stating. It's stating you were never in a valid sacramental union, and so you are still available to be in a valid sacramental union. So what would be grounds for an annulment? It could be either maybe a flaw in the rite, meaning it didn't take place in a church with an ordained minister. So for example, let's say you decided to have a destination wedding on the beach and your friend got a certificate on the internet to do the wedding. That is not proper form. So there would be grounds for an annulment there. I'm not saying you'd definitely be granted one, but there's grounds for it to be investigated. There could have been flaws in the legal capacity of the parties to marry. There could have been an impediment. So like, let's say you wanted to marry somebody, but they were still, they were married and divorced, and that was never looked at or resolved. They might not be available for a sacramental marriage. There could be flaws in the consent they gave. So, as I said before, you have to have free consent. In the beginning of a marriage rite, they're going to be asked, have you both come here of your own free will? So let's make up a fictitious example. Let's say a guy has a threat to this girl, like if she doesn't marry him, he'll kill her. Okay, that's an extreme. I imagine it's probably happened at some point along the way. Now, fear for her own life, or maybe he threatens to kill somebody else or hurt somebody else or whatever it is. Now, there's a fear component here that she's only doing it in order to preserve the life of herself or somebody else. This takes away from her freedom. And so there would be grounds for an annulment there. And I'm not an expert on this. I'm just giving you a basic understanding of what these points mean. So these are the types of things the church looks at to see if a valid union ever took place. A person could have also been too young and immature to make a good decision, lacking in freedom. They could have been pressured into it. Not intending to have children would be grounds. So if a couple enters into marriage and the one individual has no intention of ever allowing the relationship to bear children, well, that's wrong. I mean, because the point of marriage is not just unity, but openness to life. So that would be an example of possible grounds for nullity. Or if someone entered marriage without the intention of it being a lifelong commitment, like, I'll just try this out, and maybe if it don't work out, I'll just divorce the person. They're not entering into it with the intention of lifelong. Well, there could be some grounds there. So that would all be looked at. That's why the church looks at marriages and analyzes the situation to make a determination whether a valid sacramental marriage had ever taken place. Once an annulment is granted, one or both individuals are free to have a sacramental marriage in the Catholic Church. And we actually kind of see this more and more frequently happening in the church today because our world is really messed up and people's idea of what marriage is really messed up. And that's why this type of a teaching, I encourage you not just to learn it, but to share it with others. That will help society. It will help people have the proper understanding of what marriage is intended to be, how God intends it to be. Let's talk about mixed marriages for a minute, mixed and interfaith marriages. Mixed marriages refer to union between a Catholic and a baptized non-Catholic. Now, for these types of situations, there's actually a permission that needs to be granted from the church. So the non-Catholic has to agree to let the Catholic raise their children in the Catholic faith. Why is that? Well, the Catholic Church believes she has the fullness of truth that God has revealed. That this is the church Jesus started on the apostles. And this places an obligation on her to pass that on. Since we know and believe that the church has the fullness of truth, we want the children to have an opportunity to be educated in the fullness of truth. So that's why the church says, look, if you want to marry somebody who's a baptized non-Catholic, well, there has to be an agreement that that individual will allow you to raise the children in the Catholic faith. So that's up front. It's not something that's pulled out later on. Oh, by the way, so the church actually has the couple consent to that before a wedding even takes place. Now, if the couple is getting married in a non-Catholic church, they must have a Catholic witness on behalf of the Catholic Church and permission from the bishop to be married in a non-Catholic church. I'll give you an example. After I finished college, I joined a religious order for a few years to discern if I was called to the priesthood or not. And while I was there, the priest who was the head of the house I was in had a friend that was getting married to a Methodist girl. And they were getting married in the Methodist church. Now, he had these appropriate permissions to get married outside of the Catholic Church in the Methodist church. And he asked my priest friend to be the Catholic witness at the wedding. So I actually went with him to his friend's wedding in the Methodist church, and he witnessed the wedding on behalf of the Catholic Church, which made it a valid sacramental marriage through those permissions. Now, if spouses do not share their faith with each other, these differences could cause challenges, and the differences of mixed marriages should not be underestimated. I mean, if you don't share the same faith, that's tough because faith is deeply connected to our identity as children of God. And if we have fundamental differences, even if we both believe in Jesus, but we have fundamental differences, that's going to create challenges on what we think the kids should be learning. Now, if my spouse agreed to let me teach the children the Catholic faith and my spouse doesn't agree and doesn't live it, that also causes challenges in the house. Well, why doesn't mommy do that? Why do only you do that, Daddy? Why doesn't mommy agree with that? And now the kids are growing up with a challenging situation, and it makes it harder for them to embrace these teachings. And it could cause conflict between the spouses. So it shouldn't be underestimated that these could be challenging relationships. And indeed, God may call people to those types of relationships. Just know in advance that there are challenges there. It's not just easy flowing like, hey, we both believe and agree to this, and we want the children to know that. We're struggling to get along with these ideas, and how we going to strongly pass it on to children. It makes a tough situation. So a marriage between a Catholic and non-baptized person, which is an interfaith marriage, the very differences regarding faith can be enriching for both spouses, and through God's grace can lead them closer to God. And I have actually been a witness at a Catholic wedding where a Catholic was marrying a non-baptized person, and they did get permission to go through with it, but it's definitely hoped that the person at least at some point would want to be baptized. And in a sense, that would be considered the evangelization of the baptized in hopes of bringing the unbaptized to the Lord. And God does call people to that. So kind of bringing this to a close, let's remember that marriage is a sacrament. It's a covenant bond between two individuals, and it's not meant to be broken, and it mirrors the love of God. It is a calling. Marriage is a calling. It's not just something you do. It's something God calls you to. So anybody approaching marriage should be doing so prayerfully and asking God, is this the person you want me to marry? Because marriage is the path to holiness through which God provides his grace. Now, marriage doesn't guarantee happiness. It doesn't mean you're going to be happy forever. It means you're going to be challenged, and you're going to need to stick to your commitment until death. You're to lay down your life for your spouse, just as Christ laid down his life for his bride, the church, for us. This means you're going to be challenged in ways that are not easy, but God's purpose is to help you become holy. God gives you grace through this sacrament to actually be holy. Let's also realize that marriage is under attack in our culture. What marriage is, what it's supposed to be, it's being downplayed and degraded. I mean, there's TV shows that downplay marriage and what it should be, and it's based around humor, so it makes a laughing stock. We need to safeguard the sanctity of marriage and what it is in God's eyes, which is a sacrament. We must hold firm to God's intention for marriage and tell others about it in our world today. We must be willing to share our understanding of the sacrament of marriage. If we know somebody who's talking about getting married and they're not getting married in the church, we just ask them, well, how come you're not getting married in the church? And let them share. Just say, oh, well, it's your choice, but don't you want God at the center of that relationship? And let them talk, let them share. And maybe gently and encouragingly, you may be able to steer them a little bit more toward Jesus and a sacramental marriage, one that will help them experience God's grace as they go through the trials of life. And if they have the right foundation and understanding of marriage, hopefully they'll be able to carry through and become holy through those challenges and not just end up in divorce or separated like we see very often in our culture nowadays. So let's continue to pray for marriage in our world. This is an important vocation. It's a calling from God. Remember, the bookends of the Bible show us marriage and a wedding feast. So let's recall that it is sacred to God. Let it be sacred to us. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care and God bless.